like it helped us. So from the very beginning, like when we first started this coach training, the very first thing I did was I used speakerphone uh, for Gina, who's in Boston. So just telephone. And then with Rawan in Dubai, we used Skype, but I would keep the video off. So it just was like Gina would talk to Rawan through the air in Portland, Oregon to through Skype. So it blew my mind thinking, okay, Boston is talking to Dubai in Portland, and this is all happening, just like 7 a.m. Monday morning on my basically dining room table, and we did that for 6 months. That was the very first training. That was back in 2009, and from there, it just felt like the whole. Now we're using, Zoom. We have all these Britt, you've created PowerPoint presentations. It's like there's a whole 150 page training guide that's happening in the background. So it's just like this, like behemoth now compared to what it used to be. Anyway, welcome everyone to the Coaching to Flourish podcast. I am your host, John. Today here with Britt. Raj will be back in a couple weeks. I am out next week as well. I'm going to be visiting my folks in Pittsburgh. So we'll see who shows up for next week. We're not sure yet. Might be Ashley. Won't be Britt. Britt's out too. Anyway, here we are today. Hi, Britt. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Yeah, it's been a good June. Happy summer. Happy solstice. June 21. It's hard to imagine that we're almost halfway through 2022.
Wild.
Right?
Wild. Feels like
it happens at the end of June. So 9 more days. Yeah, things are good. Things are good.
Ooh. We got some cool questions for you today. Lots of fun stuff coming up in classes and some clarity things. And, the last couple of times you and I have chatted, we talked about positive psychology, right? Positive psychology looks at everything that could go right with you and all the good things. But what's coming up in some of my classes lately is, what do you do when things go wrong? Not the big wrong, not something major, but little wrong. And so I have a couple of questions around a few things that came up. So the first of which is, what happens and what do you do when the tool you're using with your client, you start to realize might not be the right fit or the best tool for this particular scenario?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we'll back up just slightly, just a little bit. The whole coaching profession was modeled off of some of counseling, some of mentoring, some of NLP, some I forget what the term. It starts with an ERS, something like this. So coaching itself came from a background where there weren't necessarily tools used, but you were focusing more on a client's, you're just going along with following the client and asking curious questions and trying to maintain a space of utter blankness and just being in curiosity. When I took coach training, to me, it felt a lot, it was loose. Like, there wasn't, coach training EDU, we emphasize establishing an agenda before every course. That's not ubiquitous in the coaching field. Some coaching programs don't train people to establish agenda. Or agendas, going to Latin already. This is ridiculous. Because what happens, seriously, my daughter, she's 15. Both my daughters are taking Latin, and they ask me Latin questions, and so I've been thinking in Latin lately. Anyway, agendas. That's not a normal thing. I think it is more common. I think Coach Training EDU is having an impact in the field where there's a recognition that agendas are important to establish. The other thing too is a lot of the tools that we're using are influenced also by NLP, or neurolinguistic programming. NLP has more of a scripted, like, this is where you start, this is the recipe, so to speak, of the step 1, step 2, step 3. NLP is extremely scripted. To me, NLP feels a lot more like Latin, where you have more rules, there are more structure to these sessions. What I found when I was working with students is having a little bit more structure, a little bit more tools is extremely useful, because young people don't necessarily have enough life experience, awareness experience to handle like just coaching sessions where they're just being asked questions. So having these structures, having these tools are really useful, right? When you're working with younger people. What I found is that they're also useful when you're working with adults, but you don't need, as a coach, you don't need to hold them so tightly. And the way I view a tool is these tools are extremely useful as scaffolds of curiosity. Like they're like a radar screen that allows you to look at the geography. It's like a map of geography, and you can say, oh, this part of the map, there's nothing there. I'm curious, what's here? Like that to me is the proper perspective to use a coaching tool, knowing that the profession itself has come from this practice of just being in curiosity, right? And that's the main difference between positive psychology counseling and coaching, is that a coach, we can have these tools, we can use these tools, but we don't diagnose, we don't, recommend action steps like, this is what you need to, this is what you need to do. It's more just staying in curiosity. So when a coaching tool does break down, like perspectives or powerful relationships or even future self or inner critic, any of these things, I used to feel freaked out. I used to think, oh no, coaching isn't working. This is bad. This is not good. Like, I'd feel a sense of panic and think, oh no, like I'm not doing it right, or I'm a bad coach. Or even when I was leading classes and there was someone in the class saying, I just don't like this tool. I don't like this perspective. This isn't making sense to me. That panic I felt doesn't happen much anymore. When a tool doesn't work now, I've learned there's usually something bigger. There's usually a reason why it didn't work. And the reason why the tool didn't work is, exploring that is more valuable often than if the tool worked itself. That is a big deal to get to that perspective. It took me about 3 or 4 years to get there myself. But once I got there, and especially when I was training people, and I realized, wow, like if this isn't working, it's worth exploring. And as a coach, you can completely toss the tool and say, great, this tool isn't working. And that's okay. That's okay. We don't have to have everything that we try out as a coach work. And there's so much value if something doesn't work, you just toss it. And clients go, whoa, okay, you just tossed it. And they feel like you're respecting them, you're following them, you're not just trying to, just work the tool, the next steps. Like you're with your client. So if a tool doesn't work, I would embrace it and go back to that curiosity and try a different tool. Or just stay in curiosity. Why didn't this one work?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I know in class, when I'm talking to coaches too, I often will say, it depends, for tips for pivoting, okay, you realize it doesn't work. You're in that, especially as a young coach, just like you said, you're in that initial like panic of what do I do? I always say there's a couple of different ways to approach that, which is one, you can tell if you told your client you were going to start a tool, it's completely okay to say to your client, hey, you know what? I'm realizing that this isn't working. I'd like to pivot in this direction. What do you think? Or, hey, it seems like this conversation would actually benefit more from this conversation than to follow this. How does that feel? But I also said too, like if you haven't introduced the tool, so I don't always introduce, even if I use even inner critic sometimes, I just go right into inner critic. I don't necessarily introduce it as a tool, which does make it easier to pivot away from if it's not working. So if I'm doing inner critic and then as I'm doing inner critic, realize, oop, nope, I was wrong. This is definitely a perspectives issue or a limiting beliefs issue. I just pivot the questions to more of that timeline. So a lot of coaches ask in class, and me and other trainers, how do you make that transition feel seamless for your client? Do you point blank tell them I made a mistake or this isn't working the way I thought it was? Or do you just sort of slide into other questions?
Depends. You can do both. Either or is valid. Yeah. I mean, I think uh, oftentimes what I'll do is I will have a tool in mind and I won't necessarily tell my client I'm working from this concept. Like I might be just that concept might be operating in the background, right? I think that's the
Right.
most common thing. I am thinking about a couple coaches I've worked with, a couple trainers we've worked with, and different conversations that we've had in the past about coaching styles and how transparent do you operate as a coach and say, okay, let's set the agenda. Let's do the time model. Let's set the agenda. What's the topic, importance, measurement? I'll echo it. Like I've heard coaches be that transparent with clients where they are in the process. I like it. I think it works. It's not a, you know, it's not a, it does not feel clunky. It feels in some ways really smooth. I think a lot of it depends on how your style how do you want to operate as a coach. Uh, I took a stand up comedy class 2016, and I went to Portland's Funniest Person competition. I did not make it out of the first round, but I had 6 minutes on the stage and material, and it was an amazing experience. I got this like it was one of the highlights of my life. And when I was in this class, I would have my little things, and I would give I named the jokes, and so I would say I would give the name of the joke, and then I would say the joke, like the topic of it. And my teacher, they're just like, this is hilarious. Like, what are you doing? Like, why? No, like stop. So I had to stop that. But it just came so much from the teaching element of being like, okay, now this is the next topic. This is the name of the thing I'm doing. Yeah, we just threw that out. Like, but it goes back to as a coach, you don't need to do that. You don't need to say, okay, now we're working perspectives, and then like let's do the perspective exercise. You don't need to. You can just go right into it, and it can be smooth in that way. Or you can do what I was doing when I was saying, okay, now my next joke is on parents eating ice cream with spoons in the freezer. Like whatever that was, you go with it, but you find your style as a coach.
Yeah, I think I love what you just said, actually, the find your style as a coach. I think that's like the key that I feel is something I try very hard to emphasize in class. There's a lot of questions about, well, what do I do when this goes wrong? And well, what if I skip this step of the tool on accident? And what if this happens? And what if that happens? And I feel compelled to let folks know that, we build tools with steps and lots of structure so that you can get started very easily as a coach. You know what to follow. You can have the tool in front of you. You know how to follow it. But the idea isn't that you're following that step-by-step rules for the rest of your coaching career. The idea is that as you get more comfortable in your coaching self, so to speak, that you develop a style that feels and looks good for you and serves the folks that you're working with. So, it's very, very common for me and my coaching practice with writers to blend inner critic, limiting beliefs, and perspectives into one like mega tool without ever introducing a tool at all and just pulling questions from those tools. So I think it's important too, like, I love what you just said about building a style that as you get more comfortable in your skin, that you build into your structure, your style, and that style includes how you address certain things that come up in a session, which brings me to my next question, which is sort of distractions or disruptions. So I'll give you an example. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on distraction disruptions from both ends. So this morning I was teaching class and I was in the middle of a coaching demo and I took a sip of my tea as my client was saying something and I went to react. So I like kind of took a deep breath in and I ended up choking on my tea and I spit out this spray of tea and it was very disruptive to the demo. But my top strength is humor and playfulness. So I made a joke. I talked about like, it's fine, I'm covered in honey tea. It's good for the skin, or I don't remember what I said, something funny. And then I just went right back into coaching, like nothing happened. Soaking wet, covered in tea, but I just pretended like nothing happened. That's my style. So that's a disruption on my end. But I get lots of questions too about what do you do if there's a really major disruption on your client's end and they step away from the computer or the session. So I'm curious, like, how do you manage disruptions, like on your end, something happens in your life and you have to step away, or your client?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there was a couple different thoughts on it. Um, I think there. I'll start with the. Um, I'll start with the most disruptive end, and let's say that you're working with someone and there's a pretty consistent pattern where, let's say they're driving every session, or there's a barking dog and it's just there, and or there's lots of, you really can't hear because the connection isn't that great. So if there are distractions that as a coach, I really do feel like I'm having to swim against the current too strongly. Like I'm really having a hard time understanding or staying focused, and it happens a lot. Then that needs to be addressed, and there needs to be a way to say, look, like how can we avoid, this? A lot of it is around technical stuff, like for whatever reason, someone's device isn't connecting well. That's on one end. Um, on the other end, there are distractions that are kind of fun, like spitting honey water all over yourself. Like, this doesn't happen every time. And then you have a choice, like, do you include it or do you dump it? And it's pretty, I got this from an acting coach where she said, if you have an emotion or something comes up, you have two choices. You can either include the emotion in what happens next, or you actively work to dump it completely. So it's a useful tool, and I found it useful as a coach to, if you have a curiosity or something that's nagging you and you think, what's, there's something there, you can try to dump it and not think about it. But if it's persistent, then I would include it and ask a question about it. Same thing with the distraction. You can either choose to dump it completely, like what you did. You just said, all right, I'm just going to dump it completely. We're moving on. Or let's include it. Like, it's kind of a funny thing. What's the honey, what's the spit honey water all over your perspective in this case, you know? When I was being trained too, there was a clever, like you got super clever points if something happens in the room and you made up a question that used something, whatever happened in the room, for your client. And the idea was that you're listening level 3 because you're using what's happening in the room and you're making up that it has to deal with your client too. And I think it's kind of fun. It's not a bad exercise as a coach, because what it does is it puts you in a perspective where you really do think everything that's happening right now relates to what my client is thinking, including your own emotion and your own thought. And when you do that as a coach, it really do start to make yourself disappear. It's like you become a vessel of curiosity for your client's value. And that's a useful tool. It's a useful perspective to be in. So, yeah, I mean, if you want extra clever points, go for a question that includes whatever you just saw. Like a train goes by, and you're like, well, what's the train perspective? Or, a train goes by, like what is the track that you see in front of yourself? Like that you can't get away from. Like it's just, that's the destination. What is that in your life? Yeah, I mean, these are fun things to do.
I
So
love the
I feel like,
creative.
yeah, that's the spectrum. Yeah, yeah, Britt.
I love the creative perspective of how can you take that and turn it into something that adds value to your client. That's a really fun way to think about how to manage distractions in a constructive way that benefits at both people.
Let's say someone knocks on the door, right? Like even right now, we're doing this, Q&A. It can be useful. You can ask, okay, so what's let's say someone, even going back to the other one, it doesn't, the other question, it doesn't work. This isn't working well. And then you get a disruption happen. It's an opportunity to take a deep breath and say, where are you at? Like, anytime a session gets disrupted, or I don't know what to do next, or I don't even know where to go, like I don't, like I'm my client just, they went on this huge tangent. I don't even know what's happening anymore. I gave them space to process, and the processing is interesting and confusing to me. A couple questions I have that help bring it back are based on everything that based on everything that's happened so far. Like, what are some takeaways? What's your biggest learning in that disruption? When you got from a coaching session to the disruption to coming back, what was the biggest shift in energy that you found? You can get really curious about what emotionally shifted, or what ideas happened in that disruption. You can ask questions, what I call in the room questions about things that just happened. It's a really useful thing to get back into it really quickly.
It reminds me of a break state that we talk about in developing reminders. So they walked away. A lot of times the break state can also help serve as an opportunity for them to digest what they've just been talking about. So it's a really great way to reset.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, and sometimes I think people wanted to shrug it off too, and just say, I don't really want to focus on it. I just want to get back into this, and that's fine too. You can really follow your client's lead. But yeah, I think it's helpful to have a couple of default questions like that, to know that if there is a disruption that happens, you have a couple questions that can get right back to it. That tends to help when, as a coach, if you feel like you have well-known questions to ask. I think it helps you approach everything else with more confidence, and clients can feel that. Because I think when clients feel that a coach is not confident, clients make up that it's about them. A coach feels like, oh, like there's something wrong in what I'm saying. I'm not doing this right, or I'm not and it has nothing to do with what the client's saying. But from the client's perspective, everything that you feel like is happening with your coach, you make up that it's about you.
Right.
So it's really extremely important as a coach to feel comfortable and confident. And if you don't, that's okay too.
Right. But it's about the practice that it
Yeah.
get there.
Yeah.
It's about those 3 trusts: trusting yourself, trusting the process, and trusting your client. I think that's key to that confidence piece. Once you feel like you really can invest your trust in those 3 things, the confidence comes. But it does take time. I think a lot of coaches in class, it's always so fun to start a new class, and then how fast it goes to get to the end, because it's always the same conversation almost no matter what class it is. The first 7 to 8 weeks, right up to their first review session, it's all like, oh man, I don't know if this is what I thought it was. It's harder than I thought it was going to be. And then their last review session, they're like, I've done it. I feel so much better. I feel confident. I figured this out. And it's so fun to be there through that whole arc and see how, once they've developed each of those trusts, once they've truly invested themselves in, okay, I trust my client. That's the easiest one typically, I find, that people tend to fall into. Then they start to trust the process. Then the last piece, I think, comes, at least from my observations, is themselves, like trusting that they can trust in the process and the client, is sort of the last thing that I noticed. And once all 3 of those things fall into place, though, that confidence just shoots right up. And you can see the difference in their overviews and the way that they hold themselves in practice sessions, things like that. It's really fun to watch.
Yeah, it is. It's remarkably timelined. I don't know. It happens I feel like the process happens somewhere between like week 6 and 10, where, like what you're saying, like around week 7 to 8, like something clicks. And there's usually a big difference between a first overview, which happens around week 6 to 8, and then a second overview, which happens around week 12 to 13. And wow, it's almost like human beings, like it takes us a couple months to really assimilate this kind of listening, this perspective. But once you get here, it's it becomes just as easy to listen from a coaching perspective as a non-coaching perspective. And I feel like when it's just as easy to shift into active empathetic listening, and you can trust it, you start to gain a confidence in your listening, and you will hear things that like are really surprising. Doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that your hearing is 100, the assumptions that we make about what we're hearing are accurate, but you do hear things. And the coolest thing for me from coaching is that in all of this, and this, ties back to the beginning, if things aren't working out, it's not your job as a coach to figure out why is it not working out, what went wrong, why am I doing this wrong? That's not your job. Your job as a coach is simply to stay curious. It's just to ask the questions. Okay, so this is interesting. This thing broke down. It's your client's job to supply the answers. And that's the coolest thing about coaching, because it flips everything on its head. And it really is truly our job. Like, it literally is your job to stay curious. And you know that you're in that space when you find yourself marveling at your client's brilliance. And that's happening and you're curious, sessions start to really sing. And that's, it took me so long to get to that space, but I feel like we emphasize it so much in our training that I hear coaches get there in like months 2, 3, 4, and it's lovely to see people get to that space so quickly.
Right. Yeah. It just takes that little bit of trust and trust that the process works, and, to push you into that confidence zone. Really what it takes is stepping out of your comfort zone and recognizing that everything that you've learned about what coaching is probably misled to some degree. We have a lot of coaches who come in and they're like, this isn't what I expected it to be, or this isn't what I thought it was going to be. And so there's an unlearning process, I think, that takes place first that a lot of people don't expect. We have a lot of people who come in from the counseling field or therapy, and they have to unlearn some things before they get into that. And I think a lot of people assume that the people with the counseling backgrounds, they'll catch on to this faster. But I've most noticed that they struggle with it more, because there's such a different way to approach a client. So once that unlearning takes place, that gets you to that place of vulnerability around, like you were saying, week 6 or 7. But then once you accept that it's okay to be vulnerable, because everyone else in my class is vulnerable, now it's time for me to trust what I'm doing works. Once you start to do that, like you just said, things really start to progress forward in a really beautiful way.
I have to stop here. That's it's a quick half hour, but there we are. Thank you, Britt. And thank you, everyone listening to this. Ashley, for setting this up, getting the logistics going. And I will not be here next week. Most likely Ashley and someone else will. And hope you have a great, happy summer, happy solstice. And I will see you in 2 weeks. Bye, everyone.